I recently, as an adult, read The Great Gatsby for the first time. Initially, this video was going to be a very short script, focused on 3 rather trivial observations. But between the time I planned on writing the script and the time I actually did, I found that I also wanted to talk about assigned reading for English classes as well. Still, I will start with 2 of my initial thoughts: books as physical objects and Facebook. Now, I am extremely anti-Facebook, and this is reinforced by the fact that I was actually on the site for 2 years in undergrad. I was basically dragged on kicking and screaming because none of the student groups at my school would use the in-house announcement system for student activities. I deleted my Facebook account pretty much the moment I graduated, and my experience in those 2 years has reinforced my determination never to go back. But I will admit that it was interesting for me to look at the books and music other people liked when I was on there. And one thing that I noticed was that a substantial portion of my Facebook friends had listed their favorite books as either Ender's Game or The Great Gatsby. I concluded that for these people, it probably meant they had not read a work of fiction since high school. To Kill a Mockingbird was probably a popular favorite book as well, but that is a book that I have been meaning to read pretty much all my life, and so it did not stand out as much. Neither Ender's Game nor The Great Gatsby was particularly on my list of books I felt I needed to read, but Gatsby is at least generally considered a core part of the American literary canon, and therefore always something I figured I would read if and when I got around to it. And this takes me into the topic of books as physical objects. In general, the quality of bookmaking has been getting notably worse, especially over the last 25 years. However, when it comes to public domain books, you have competition for the most popular public domain titles, and you can often get some pretty nice books at a pretty decent price. Of the publishers putting out hardbacks of popular public domain books, my personal favorite is Peter Popper Press. They've done a few under their own imprint, such as my standalone copy of Kahlil Gibran's The Prophet and Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and quite a few under their Masterpiece Library imprint. I do have some minor quibbles with the quality of Masterpiece Library books, but for a very reasonable price, the pages are nice thick paper and sewn in, and the text is well formatted. I have most of their books, and the experience of reading them is so nice that when I read one, I often read more than one. After reading Anne of Green Gables, I read Jekyll and Hyde and The Picture of Dorian Gray. After reading Dracula, I read Frankenstein, Treasure Island, and of course The Great Gatsby. Unlike most of the aforementioned books, where I knew the basis of the plot through osmosis and adaptations, I was surprised by how little I actually knew about The Great Gatsby. A lot of people read it in high school, but it seems like we don't really discuss it outside high school English class, or if people do, I never picked up on what it was about. Which is interesting to me in light of how popular it was as a favorite book on Facebook when I was in undergrad. J. Gatsby puts on a persona to attract and impress crowds of strangers, who are nonetheless not particularly impressed, while doing it all in pursuit of a much more intimate connection. So perhaps it's not too surprising at all that people who are active on Facebook relate strongly to J. Gatsby. And this, what I have said so far, is about where I originally expected this video to end. I was planning on this being a very short video, and the script up to this point is under a page. The only other thing that I wanted to observe is that reading The Great Gatsby made me realize that nearly all great works of literature feature at least one death of a major character, or someone close to a major character. Indeed, as I ran through every classic novel I remember reading, including classics of science fiction and fantasy, I was only able to come up with 3 books that I do not recall ever having such major character deaths: 1984, Brave New World, and The Handmaid's Tale. However, even if I'm recalling correctly that there were no such deaths in these books, these are all notable works of dystopian fiction presenting a sort of living death. Indeed, if I am forgetting that these books had salient deaths, it is precisely because the living death of the novel was more horrifying than the specter of actual physical death. The Alchemist, subject of my second video, does not feature major character deaths, but I've also contended and maintained that it is not properly speaking a novel. And I can point to more than a few novels I love where no major character dies, but these are all relatively obscure works of speculative fiction for the most part. There are, however, times where a major death can still result in an uplifting book. I would argue that this is the case for my favorite English language novel, Cry the Beloved Country, as well as another book I love, A General Theory of Oblivion. The crucial thing, however, is that the character depth has to be meaningful and hopeful, a la Tuesdays at Morrie's. Anyways, this is relevant because around the same time that I was reading these Masterpiece Library public domain books, I was also going down a bit of a rabbit hole in my nonfiction reading, and I realized it was coming to greatly depress me. I will almost certainly talk about that rabbit hole at some point when I've had more time to process, but I realized I want to make a conscious effort to read more uplifting books. However, for me, I'm not simply looking for a feel-good book, for all that there's an entire cottage industry of that. I am looking for something that is uplifting in a fashion I find meaningful. I've started finding more such books and may talk about this as well, but I will say that my first impulse of going on Amazon and seeing what people who liked The Alchemist also liked was quite unhelpful. What I discovered is that most of the recommendations were other short, classic books with fairly simple language. And I realized that the pattern of similarity I was seeing is that these are exactly the kind of books that high school English teachers like assigning. Among the books that Amazon thinks are similar to The Alchemist are Of Mice and Men, Animal Farm, and Lord of the Flies. All of these are books that I read in middle or high school. I read Animal Farm and Lord of the Flies on my own, but I read Of Mice and Men because my 8th grade English teacher assigned it. I hated Of Mice and Men, and it is the reason I still have not made any further attempt to read Steinbeck, even knowing that Alan Paton, author of Cry the Beloved Country, was a Steinbeck fan. From my perspective as an adult, I would say that Of Mice and Men is probably not ideal reading for 8th graders, and it is definitely terrible assigned reading material for 8th graders. I realized, in looking at its also-reds on Amazon, The Alchemist, as a short classic book with simple language, is a book English teachers are almost certainly assigning, and that idea pains me greatly. Since Gibran's The Prophet is also short and classic, I imagine there are a good many English teachers assigning that as well, and ruining it for many of their students. Now, I think at this point I should probably stop to confess that I have hated the modern industrial education system since at least high school. This is not because I was a bad student. To the contrary, I pretty consistently got A's in classes I liked, and A's and B's in the ones I didn't. It's because I recognized, even when I was in the system, that the school was trying to beat the habit of learning out of me and the habit of compliance into me. The problem is that even as a kid, I saw clearly enough to see that the public education system was very bad at doing the things it claimed to do. But this is not a video about why I hate industrial education, though I will probably make multiple videos about that in the future. It's a video about all the things that reading The Great Gatsby has got me thinking about, one of which is that I suspect that if I had been required to read this book in high school, or especially middle school, I probably would have hated it as much as I hated Of Mice and Men. Indeed, the only other assigned reading I remember hating that much was Catcher in the Rye, and it was because I found Holden Caulfield to be an insufferable whiner. Holden is certainly relatable for some teenagers, but I had gone through the angst stage when I was 12, and I realized adults punished me for it. By the time I was 14, I had thoroughly beaten down those tendencies in myself, but when I was assigned Catcher in the Rye at 17, I was still nowhere near mature enough to empathize or sympathize with Holden, who to my mind was acting like a 12-year-old. I rather imagine that I would have had an even harder time having sympathy for Gatsby, an adult with tendencies that, if they were not as openly angsty as Holden Caulfield, were still incredibly self-indulgent. Now, I think there is a kind of irony in having the classic book about teenage angst and rebellion as assigned reading at all, but I'm also realizing as I look back that I have mostly forgotten even the assigned reading I enjoyed. Because I read a lot independently, I read quite a few books in high school that high school teachers often assign, but mine did not. This includes the aforementioned Lord of the Flies and Animal Farm. These are both deeply unpleasant books that distressed me to read them, but because I made the decision to read them myself, I never hated them for telling upsetting stories, and I can now look back at them and appreciate the intended message. I am realizing that except for Catcher in the Rye and Of Mice and Men, those two books I read with white-hot hatred and resentment, and some books that I picked myself according to projects that gave me at least partial free rein, I have mostly forgotten the books that were assigned reading, yet I remember the ones I picked myself very clearly. It seems incredibly intuitive to me that people are more invested in books they pick themselves, or at least feel like they had a hand in book picking, than books that are assigned by an authority figure. It fits with so much of the evidence we have from cognitive psychology, with my own lifelong intuitions and experiences, and with my experience looking back and comparing the English class books that I chose to read in high school versus those I was told to. The Great Gatsby will likely never be one of my own favorite books, but I am very glad I read it as an adult, or at least that I was never assigned to read it as a teenager. And I suppose this is all reminding me as well that I really do need to read To Kill a Mockingbird.